Hey, there we go. All right. So all of the recordings from every class that we do here will be posted under this class recordings tab, just like this one from our first class together on January 7th. So it'll be set up with the date and then sort of the name of the subject that we were going over to hopefully make it a little bit easier for you to go back and find when you need to. So like I said, today we're covering something that I think is really cool and kind of a fun start to the semester. And that is this idea of sort of energy flow in ecosystems. So how does energy get from one group of organisms, one group of plants and animals, to another one? And what are sort of some of the stages that the energy has to go through in order to get from the tiniest little ant or grasshopper all the way up to the biggest wolf or hawk or whatever the top predator is in an ecosystem. All right, so energy flow, all about where are the plants and animals in an ecosystem getting their energy from. Everything that's alive on planet Earth has to get its energy from somewhere. And so today we're going to kind of look into how that energy flows throughout all of the different plants and animals in an environment, in an ecosystem. So all of the organisms in an ecosystem, in an environment, fit in somewhere in sort of this energy flow chain. So they all play some sort of role in the environment. And we can kind of separate them out into two major different groups. There are the producers, also known as the autotrophs. And these are the organisms in an environment that are able to make their own food. So autotroph, the auto is kind of like automatic, because they're able to automatically make their own food, their own energy. So the vast majority of the producers on Earth are plants. So plants are able to use the light energy from the sun and make their own food and their own energy out of that sun's energy. So that's why we call them producers, because they are able to produce their own energy, their own food. Even plants like the Venus flytrap down here, that is famous for eating and digesting small insects like flies and grasshoppers and stuff. This still uses photosynthesis in order to get most of its energy. It still produces most of its own energy. It just uses the flies and the grasshoppers and stuff that it eats as kind of extra source of vitamins and minerals. It's sort of like they're sort of acting like a vitamin, like a multivitamin that you take with dinner. That's kind of what the flytrap is using its fly or cricket meal for. So producers make their own food, and plants, they do it through a process called photosynthesis, which we might talk about a little bit later on in the term. But producers produce their own food. They make their own energy from the sun. So this is kind of the first big group of organisms in an ecosystem. The second big group are not producers, they are consumers. So consumers, they can't make their own food from the sun, right? If you go stand out in a sunny parking lot for a couple hours, you're not going to feel more full when you started versus when you ended. So consumers cannot make their own food. They have to get it from other sources and the environment. And it just so happens that eating other organisms and the environment is a great way for consumers to get energy. So we can sort of split our consumers, also known as heterotrophs. Hetero meaning like different, so they have to eat other food, they have to eat different organisms to get energy. And we can sort of split these into three major groups. There are herbivores, which eat primarily plant material. In most cases, they only eat plants. There are carnivores that have to eat other animals. And then there are omnivores, like ourselves, that eat a mixture of plants and animals. So herbivore is a plant eater, carnivore is a meat eater, and omnivore means you eat kind of a mix of both. There's also even scavengers, which are specific types of omnivores that specifically eat dead animals. So things like vultures or hyenas in the African plains, those are scavengers. They eat other types of animals, but only after those animals are already dead. So these are all kind of grouped under the big label of consumers. Can't make their own food, they have to eat other organisms. So to make sure that you guys kind of have the difference between the producers and the consumers down, I'm going to show you guys a series of pictures, a series of different organisms. And I want you to tell me if it is a producer or a consumer. And then, if it is a consumer, I want you to try and figure out, is it an herbivore, is it a carnivore, or is it an omnivore? Oh, I almost forgot. One more important group is the decomposers. These are organisms that break down dead and decaying material and return the nutrients to the environment. So things like bacteria, things like mushrooms and mold and other fungi, things like worms and things that live in the soil. These take those dead plants and animals and break down all of their different individual pieces and kind of return. They use some of those nutrients for energy and they return other nutrients to the soil. So decomposers are super important because they are what is responsible for clearing out all of the dead and decaying matter in the environment. Without decomposers, basically all the dead stuff, all the dead natural garbage would just kind of pile up in the ecosystem. And nobody wants that. It would smell, it would be gross, there'd be disease everywhere. So our decomposers help us get rid of a lot of the natural waste in the environment. Okay, on to the picture section. So again, I want you to tell me, is this organism a producer or consumer? And then if it's a consumer, what type? Herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore? So this deer, right here.
Consumer.
Yep, exactly. It is a consumer. Ooh, and Victoria has nailed it. It is a consumer who is a herbivore. So you have deers primarily eat shrubs and leaves and plants. So it is an herbivore. But since it has to eat other organisms in general, it's a consumer.
I can't hear you.
Let me try moving the mic a little bit closer. Also, you can turn up the volume on your computer if you need to. What about over here? We have an apple tree that is producing some apple fruit right now. Is this a producer or a consumer?
Producer.
Produce.
Producer, precisely. A lot of right answers in the chat as well. So apple tree is a plant. You plant it in the ground and it uses the energy from the sun in order to grow, in order to create more branches and leaves, and more importantly for us, in order to create fruit like apples that we can eat. All right, what about this black bear here? Are black bears producers or consumers?
Big consumers.
These guys are big and these guys are definitely consumers. And so what type of consumer do you think black bears are? Do you think they're herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores?
Carnivore.
I think omnivore.
Mm-hmm. So I'm getting some omnivores. I saw carnivore
They
in the chat.
I'll say omnivore.
Omnivore.
Mm-hmm. I would say with black bears, especially, I would go the route of omnivore. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Breeze, exactly. So black bears, they will eat like fish and small mammals if they're able to catch them, but they're also happy eating fruits like berries and nuts that they can find while
And
they're
all people.
So black bears will kind of eat anything that looks like food to them, whether it's a fruit or a nut or an animal. They're
What
down
about people?
eating it. People, they really don't like eating people if they can avoid it. So they like to stay away from people unless you go camping and you leave all your food garbage like sitting right outside your tent. In Texas, that's not such a big deal. But if you ever camp in like the Midwest or in the West, like Utah or Colorado or something, make sure that you keep your food secured and safe, because black bears will happily wander by your campsite and kind of tear everything up, hoping to get to whatever food scraps you left behind. They got very good noses up there. All right, what about this lynx right here? So a lynx is like a wildcat type of thing. So is this a producer or a consumer?
Consumer.
He a consumer.
Mm-hmm. Precisely. And so if it's a consumer, is a lynx most likely a carnivore, omnivore, or herbivore?
I think he a carnivore. They eat fish and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Pretty much all cats are carnivores. So they consist almost entirely on a meat diet, whether it's fish or mice or rats or rabbits or birds, anything that they can catch that's smaller than them, that is an animal, these guys will eat it. So that's why, like, if you ever hear stories about people trying to feed their cats like a plant-based diet or like a vegan diet or something, that is very bad even for pet cats. They have to have food in their diet that's based on meat. So cat food has a really high protein level and is made mostly out of meat because cats in general are meat eaters. They have to have a meat-based diet. That's just how they have developed to survive. Okay, what about, so we got two animals or two organisms in this picture, I should say. We have this Venus flytrap with a little fly stuck in its grasp. So I want you to tell me, what is the flytrap and what is the fly? A producer or a consumer?
Fly trap, it's a producer.
Consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And the little fly, it's a consumer.
Exactly. So even though it's going to eat this fly, the fly trap is still a producer because it gets the majority of its energy from the sunlight. It only eats the fly for like vitamins and minerals and stuff kind of like that. But most of the energy for the fly trap comes from the sun. It makes its own energy. The fly, though, is a consumer. The reason why it landed on this fly trap is because the fly trap makes this kind of sticky substance that the fly thinks smells and tastes very yummy. So it was looking to eat something, so it landed here on the fly trap. Ended up being its last mistake, but it was looking for something to eat. So a fly is a consumer. It has to eat other organisms, plants, animals, mixture, in order to get energy. So we have our producers, we have our consumers, the energy is flowing from one to the other, but all of the energy in an ecosystem originally starts as sunlight. So the sun is the source of all of the energy in our ecosystem. Because if you think about it, the sun is what provides energy to the plants. And then the plants, the producers, are what provide energy to the whole rest of the ecosystem. So either you're a herbivore or an omnivore, which means that you eat the plants and get energy from them directly, or you're a carnivore, and so you eat the organisms that eat the plants. Everything comes back to the plants, the producers, and all of the plants use sunlight for their source of energy. So the sun is what powers our basically life on Earth. It's all due to the energy that the plants, the producers, are able to capture for the sunlight. So the sun and the energy from the sun is crucial for everything on Earth to survive. It's where it all starts. So one way that we can show kind of how the energy goes from the sun to the plants, to the producers, and then to the consumers in an ecosystem is called a food chain. So a food chain is like one straight line path that shows the flow of energy in an ecosystem. So it shows we start with the sun gives energy to the producers give energy to the herbivores give energy to the carnivores. In a food chain, we usually don't specifically label them as herbivores and carnivores. Instead, we call them a first level consumer or a primary consumer. These are the guys that eat the producers. And then we also have second level consumers, which eat the first level consumers. So you kind of start off on the bottom with your producer, and then you have your first level consumer, which eats it. And then you have the second level consumer, which eats the first. And in more complex food chains, you can keep going higher to third and fourth level even. So eventually everything will come back to the decomposers, which break down and recycle the dead consumers and producers back into the environment. So a very simple, kind of typical food chain is going to look something like this. So we have our sun, again, our main initial source of energy. It provides energy to the grass, which is our producer in this little mini ecosystem. The grass is then eaten by the mouse, and it gives its energy to the mouse, which is our first level consumer. And then the mouse, it provides energy to the kestrel, which is like a type of hawk, which is our second level consumer. So one thing that I want you guys to notice about our food chain here is the direction that our arrows are pointing. So the arrows are obviously not showing that the first animal eats the second animal, right? That's not what this direction of the arrow means. It's not saying, oh, the mouse eats the hawk, because that's obviously very silly. Instead, what it's showing is the energy flow. So the mouse gets energy from the grass, and then when the hawk eats the mouse, the hawk gets energy from the mouse. So the sun provides energy to the grass provides energy to the mouse, and the mouse provides energy to the hawk, to the kestrel. So that's what kind of the direction of our arrows mean. They're not saying that the mouse eats the hawk. They're saying that the mouse provides energy to the hawk when it gets eaten. So we can have a big, pretty picture, or we can have a simple food chain. Again, we have our primary consumer, our secondary consumer, And in this one, we even go up to a third level, which we call a tertiary consumer. Tertiary means like number 3 or a third level. And then again, our arrows indicate energy flow. So the maize or the corn is our producer. It provides energy to the locust when the locust eats it. The locust then gets eaten by the lizard and provides energy from the locust to the lizard. The snake then eats the lizard, and the lizard provides energy to the snake. So a food chain, very simple, go from producer to one consumer to the next consumer to the next consumer, all in one kind of simple straight line. So that is our food chain, a very sort of simple and easy way of looking at things. However, as always in science, it's never quite this simple for long, because most ecosystems have lots of primary consumers and lots of secondary and lots of tertiary consumers that live in them. It's not just one in each level. So instead, we don't have just one single food chain. We have a food web. So a food web, just like its name suggests, is a diagram that shows the energy flow through many different organisms and an ecosystem. So it's like you take a whole bunch of food chains from the same environment and put them together in one big web. So now you're going to have multiple different organisms at each level. So here's sort of an example of like a typical forest or meadow food web. Again, we have the producers kind of at the base of our food web. So grasses, shrubs, trees, fruits, nuts, all of those sort of make up the producer level. Those then provide energy to our first level or our primary consumers. So the herbivores in our ecosystem, like a rabbit, a mouse, a grasshopper, a termite, all of these guys get energy by eating producers. We then have some secondary consumers, like our snake, our shrew, our woodpecker, and even the fox, which eat our first level guys right here. And then finally, our third level consumer, our fox, is the only third level consumer on here because he's the only one that eats some second level consumers. So again, we have lots of different sort of overlapping food chains in here. So we have one food chain that goes, say, producers to termite to woodpecker. And then another one that goes producers to grasshopper to shrew to fox. And then another one even that goes from producers to grasshopper to mouse to snake. So it's connecting all of the different levels of consumers, essentially. So one thing that you can kind of notice is that some organisms can act as a second level or a first level consumer, depending on what type of food chain that you're looking at. So like our mouse here, for example, is a first level consumer because it eats producers. A mouse eats plants. But a mouse is an omnivore, so it also eats small insects like grasshoppers. So a mouse can also act as a second level consumer when it eats other organisms like grasshoppers. So the main way to tell what sort of level that an organism is at, what sort of consumer it is by look at what it is eating. If it's eating first level consumers, then it has to be a second level consumer, like our shrew here that likes to eat grasshoppers and termites. If it's only eating producers like this rabbit over here, then it has to be a first level consumer. So by looking at the different organisms and what they're eating, you should be able to kind of figure out what level do these organisms sit at on the food web. So here is kind of a slightly more simple one. We have some primary producers, our producers down here, so our plants that are providing the initial energy. We then have our primary consumers, insects and large herbivores and small herbivores on our primary consumer level. We then have our secondary consumers, like snakes and lizards and badgers. And then finally, we have our third or fourth level consumers, also sometimes called our top predators, like hawks and coyotes and mountain lions. So you know that something is a top predator in an ecosystem if it is not eaten by any other organisms. So like you see, even snakes in this example, which could potentially be a top level predator in some ecosystems. And this one, snakes could still be eaten by hawks. So because of that, they are no longer a top predator. They're just a second level consumer. So again, this particular picture doesn't really give you the specific names. So again, we have our producers, our first level or our primary consumers, our second level or our secondary consumers, our third level or our tertiary consumers, and then sometimes in really big, really complex food webs, you can have fourth level or quaternary consumers. Again, if you follow the arrows, you can see what these organisms are providing energy to and determine what level consumer that a specific organism is based on the types of other organisms that it eats. So if it eats lots of primary consumers, then it's definitely a second level consumer. If it is pretty high up on the food web and is eating a lot of second level consumers, then it's probably a third or fourth level consumer, depending on kind of how complex that your food web gets. So if you ever see something referred to as a trophic level, that's just talking about the kind of level of producer or consumer that you're at. So these guys are all called the trophic levels. Trophic just essentially means having to do with like energy or ecosystem energy. So we start with our producers and then go up to the first, second, and third level consumers from there. So our first level consumers would definitely be all herbivores for the most part. Our second level is probably a mix of omnivores and carnivores. And then our third and fourth level consumers are usually pretty much just straight carnivores. They're responsible for only eating other animals. All right, so I know that it's a whole bunch of different kind of levels and a whole bunch of different food webs that I just tossed at you. Does anybody have any questions so far on how the food webs are set up or kind of how to read where the energy in a food web is going? Anything that you want me to talk about with the food web or the levels?
Yeah, Mr. Stanley, on the, I think it was the daily or something, the homework, are we supposed to fill out like where each animal is, like if it's a producer or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. And actually, I'll make sure to go and kind of review the homework a little bit before we.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you the same question. I was a little bit confused about
Yeah, so
the
I think
assignment.
because hold on, let me see if that's the that section. Yeah, it is. Okay, good. So that
Because I didn't know if you wanted us to give you the description of what it meant and then put the
Ah.
animals, or
nope, just the animals. So for people wondering
okay.
what she is asking about, for the assignment that got posted today that some people have already taken a look at, it gives you a food web, East Texas food web. So we've got some hawks, we got some owls, we got some deer, some mice, some ants and beetles, some oats, some oaks. And so if you're doing it on the Google Doc, then I just want you to write the name of each organism in the correct level. So all of the producers, all of the plants, you'll write in this box right here. You'll then write all of the primary consumers in the second box, all of the secondary consumers in the third box, so on and so forth. So you look at this diagram and pick an organism like the white-tailed deer, and then figure out, is a white-tailed deer a producer, a primary consumer, secondary consumer, so on and so forth. If you want to do the Google form version, it's a little bit more straightforward for people who like doing this one.
It's more easy.
So this one, I have all of the organisms listed out alphabetically from ants to water oaks. And all you have to do is tell me, are ants producers? Are they primary consumers, secondary consumers, or top predators?
So that's the other way to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, because I did that one, but in the due now area where it shows like that we have work today, it's still showing that it's due now.
Mm-hmm. So if you do this version, the Google form version, the downside of it is that it doesn't update your Google Classroom automatically.
Okay.
You have to, if you want to mark it, check it as completed, then you have to go in and manually hit the turn in button, even though you're not actually turning in anything on Classroom.
Okay, so I'll go through
that. You don't have to do that if you just want to leave it still saying missing, and I will get a notification to my email saying that you turned it in, and so I can go in and look at your answers and then your Google Classroom for you.
Okay.
So if you do it on the Google form, then yeah, you just have to manually go back to the Google Classroom and hit turn in once you're done.
Okay, gotcha.
So, Mr. Michael, so this diagram on the assignment is the same, like the one you just showed us, like it's the same concept, right?
Yep. This diagram is the exact same one as this diagram.
Okay.
So I just like to provide the two different ways to do it, because I know some people like doing the Google Doc version more, and some people like doing the Google form version more. So you don't have to do both of them since they're the same thing. You just have to pick one that you like to do more and do that version.
No, I was asking about the diagram you just show us in the lesson. So it's the same, like the same concept, like the pyramid one? No, not like the pyramid, I see it in Google. No, the other one you just show us, the last one. Yes, that one.
This one?
Yeah, it's the same like concept.
It's a similar concept. We'll talk about it in a little bit before we finish up here tonight. So does anybody have any questions about the food web worksheet or assignment?
No.
All right. Cool. So again, you're just going through each individual organism and telling me, is it a producer, a primary, secondary consumer, or a top predator? If you've already done this assignment, I know a couple people have already done it and turned it in, but after the notes tonight, you realize that you messed some stuff up and you want to go back and fix it. That is totally fine. You can go back and fix it up until I grade it and give it back to you. And I'll only look at the most recent version that you turned in to me. So if you did an old version, but then you redo it and change some of your answers, I'm not going to look at the old version. I'll only look at the most recent one that you turned in. All right. So the final thing that I wanted to go over with you guys is the idea of an ecological pyramid. So it's sort of similar to a food chain where you have these different levels. Only instead of showing all of the arrows showing how the energy flows through the ecosystem, instead you're tending to use these pyramids to look at kind of bigger concept things. So there's three that we're going to talk about. The first two, the pyramid of numbers and the biomass pyramid, aren't as important, so we're going to talk about those ones pretty quickly. But then the more important one is the energy pyramid. So we'll talk about that one in a little bit more detail. So a pyramid of numbers, just like it says that it'll do, it compares the total number of organisms at each level in a food chain. So the reason why it's set up as a pyramid is that generally the producers have far and away the highest population in the ecosystem. Then the primary consumers tend to have the next highest population. The secondary consumers tend to have the next highest population. And then finally, the top predators, the third or fourth level consumers, tend to have the smallest population. And so even though you might have a huge number of producers and a really large number of primary consumers, an ecosystem tends to have a fairly low number of top predators. So while you might see tons of plants and tons of insects and tons of like small birds in an ecosystem, you're probably not going to see tons of hawks or tons of wolves or tons of mountain lions. For reasons that we'll talk about in a little bit, the higher that you go up the food web, the fewer numbers that you tend to have in your population. So this is the pyramid of numbers. It's just kind of comparing total populations of these different levels. The biomass pyramid is a very similar type of concept, only instead of showing numbers, instead it represents it with the weight. So the amount of living matter in a food chain. Again, producers, there tends to be tons and tons of them, and they can get really, really, really large. Like think about like trees and forests and stuff. So there is a lot of weight, a lot of biomass at the producer level. And then just like with the numbers, as you go up in food web level, as you get higher and higher up into the third and fourth level consumer, you tend to have less and less and less total weight at that level. Again, because you have fewer numbers, and those numbers tend to be spread out over a large area. So the reason why, as you get higher and higher and higher in the food web, you tend to have smaller numbers and a smaller weight, smaller biomass. Has to do with how energy gets passed on from one level to another. So when you eat something, you get energy from that food, and then you use that energy to grow, to move around, and to stay alive. So that means that if something eats you, it's not going to get all of the energy that you've eaten over your lifetime. Instead, it's only going to get kind of a small percentage of your total energy, because a lot of the energy that you took in, you've already used up. You've used it to stay alive, to keep your heart beating, to move around, to do stuff. So anything that eats you is only going to get a small amount of your total energy. So only part of the energy from one level of the food web is available to the next level. So we can use a similar ecological pyramid called an energy pyramid to kind of illustrate this concept. And again, it's the idea that you start off, the most amount of energy is contained down at sort of the producer level. And then as you go up, there is fewer and fewer total energy available. So kind of a basic rule that scientists have figured out by studying this stuff over many, many years is that only about 10% of one level's energy gets transferred to the next level. So at, say, the primary consumer level, 90% of the energy of that level is going to be used up by those herbivores, by those primary consumers. And so only 10% of that energy is going to be passed on up to the secondary consumer level. So this 10% number is kind of the rule of thumb for looking at energy levels from one to the other. So again, if we think about kind of overall, like a simple food chain here, where we have producers, grasshoppers, shrews, and owls. So say that at the producer level, if in this specific area, we were able to calculate that these producers receive about 1,000 kilocalories, which is a US calorie, like capital C calorie. So if 1,000 calories are produced by the grasses and shrubs of this environment from the energy they get from the sun, a lot of that energy is going to be used by the grasses and shrubs to grow and reproduce and create new organisms, new grasses and shrubs. So only about 10% of that original 1,000, only about 100 calories are going to be passed on to the first level consumer level. In this case, it's like the grasshoppers. So the grasshoppers are only going to eat about 100 of the total 1,000 calories from the producer level. So then these grasshoppers are going to grow, they're going to develop, they're going to create new baby grasshoppers. They're going to use a lot of this energy. So these shrews up here that eat the grasshoppers are only going to get about 10 calories of energy from the 100 that are eaten by the grasshoppers. So that's that 10% change that I was talking about. So 10% of 1,000 is 100. 10% of 100 is 10. And then finally, up at the owl level, of the 10 calories that are generated at the second level consumer level, only about one of those will be passed on to the predator, top predator level, this third level consumer up here. So this kind of illustrates why, as you get higher and higher up in the food chain, there are fewer organisms, fewer numbers that are more spread out. They're not as dense. because not very much, only a small percentage of the original energy available in the environment gets passed all the way up to that top of the food chain. So for the 1,000 calories that were originally produced by our plants and shrubs at the producer level, only 1 of every 1,000 makes it all the way up to the consumer level. So this is why you're not going to see tons and tons of owls or wolves or mountain lions or grizzly bears. They're never going to be hundreds of them in an area like there would be grasshoppers or mice, because there's just not enough energy in the ecosystem to support those big, big numbers. So as you go up the energy pyramid, there's less and less and less energy available at each level. Again, it all comes down to that 10% rule. Only about 10% of the energy at one level is going to be passed up the food web to the next level. All right, does anybody have any questions about the kind of energy pyramid and what it represents for the food web?
No.
Awesome, thanks, Osman. All right. How about anybody else? Anybody have any questions about not just the energy pyramids, but the food webs, the trophic levels, the producers, consumers? Any questions about anything that we've covered so far here this evening?
Nope, I'm good.
I think I'm good.
All right, cool. So I already showed you guys a little bit of the assignment that got posted today about the different levels of the food web. Your daily assignment for tomorrow, the Wednesday assignment, is also a food web question. I'm hitting the food webs hard because the STAR test, if you ever have to take the STAR test in biology, the ecology questions, the energy questions that it likes to ask usually revolve around looking at and reading food webs. So I want to make sure that you guys are pretty comfortable with picking out important information from a food web. So Wednesday's daily assignment has sort of a similar food web setup. This one's a little bit nicer. It has cute pictures of all the organisms. And then ask a series of questions for you guys to answer about this specific food web. The first couple questions are pretty simple, just asking you to identify different organisms that consume certain organisms and what those organisms then eat in turn. I want you to try and figure out how many organisms are at certain levels of the food web. So you don't have to name what they are, you just have to tell me how many. And then definitely make sure to read the last two questions carefully. These questions are based on STAR questions, so they're lifted kind of similarly from the STAR test. And so they're relatively simple questions, but they're worded in a way to make you really have to go back and look at and think about the food web and the different levels that are in there. So question 4 asks about which organisms provide energy for secondary consumers. And then question 5 asks about if the birds suddenly all died off in this food web, which organisms would likely see their population go up if the birds suddenly disappeared. So again, make sure you read the questions carefully and can kind of pick out the important information from the food web that's pictured up here. And just like with the other assignment, the Tuesday assignment, this one is available in the Google form version and in the exact same questions, but in the Google Doc version. So again, you're free to do whichever one that you want to do, the Google form or the Google Doc. Just remember that if you do the Google form version, it does not automatically update your Google Classroom. So you have to go in and manually click off that you did it on the assignment page on the Google Classroom. All right, so does anybody have any final questions about the Tuesday assignment or the Wednesday assignment?
Not for me, thank you.
All right. Let's see.